Well, session number 76 of Mark, looking at verses 10 through 21 of chapter 14, flying through the dew here. Title, Betrayal as Passover Begins. Well, now we're going to go from Mary's act of love and devotion in anointed Jesus with a year's salary in nard, and we're going to move to Judas' betrayal in hate and treachery in contrast to Mary's act. So let's begin immediately, get into verse 10 of chapter 14. And again, we're going to look at chapter 10 through 21, did I say? Yeah. So that's about 12 verses. And Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went off to the chief priests in order to betray him, Jesus, to them. He knew that they wanted to do away with him, apparently, and he went to offer. First, there are a few points about Judas, maybe, just to be sure you're on the same page here. He appears last in all lists of the inner 12, the 12 disciples that Jesus has been mentoring, teaching, bringing along during these 3 years. Every time they print the list of the names, Judas is last. Judas was the only non-Galilean in the 12. He was from Judea. He's from the southern kingdom, not Galilee. His name means man of Keriot. That's the meaning, at least, of Iscariot. Man of Keriot, K-E-R-I-O-T-H, which was a small town in Judea, about 23 miles south of Jerusalem. Now, Judas took the initiative. Various members of the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees with the Herodians had long wished to find a way to take Jesus out of the picture permanently. We've seen those before. Mark has at least 3 such occasions. And Judas is going to offer them an opportunity to take Jesus down that they couldn't turn down. And what was the chief priest's response? Verse 11, and they, the chief priests, were glad when they heard this and promised to give him money, and he, Judas, began seeking how to betray him, Jesus, at an opportune time. The chief priests, by the way, were the leaders of 24 divisions of priests. They were broke into these divisions to cover the work of the temple. You can check 1 Chronicles 24 if you want to see it. Each order served 2 one-week stints of service per year in the temple. So 48 weeks were covered by these chief priests and their followers, the ones that they were chief over. J.B.'s father, John the Baptist's father, Zechariah, was serving such a one-week stint when he was visited by Gabriel as Gabriel announced John the Baptist's birth. Let me read in Luke 1:8. Now it came about while he, as Zechariah, was performing his priestly service before God, that one week stint, of which he did 2 a year, in the order of his division. So he was serving for his division during that 1 week. 1 of 2 weeks he would serve during the year. Betrayal is spoken about in the Psalms. One is about a betrayal of David. And I think if you think about it for a minute, you figure out who is being spoken of. Verse 41, Psalm 41:9. Even my close friend, this is David writing, even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. But Jesus claimed that verse, Psalm 41:9, was prophetic also. Look at John 3:18, where Jesus is speaking. John 13:18. I do not speak of all of you. I know the ones I have chosen, but it is that the scripture may be fulfilled. He who eats my bread has lifted up his heel against me. Of course, Jesus was speaking of Judas as he was about to betray him. So this is an upper room discourse that Jesus was given to the remaining 11. So Jesus wasn't taken by surprise at this betrayal. He even speaking of it right along. John 6:64 says, but there are some of you who do not believe. This is Jesus speaking again. For Jesus, and this is now John's insertion, for Jesus knew from the beginning who they were who did not believe and who it was that was going to betray him. And then in verse 70 of chapter 6, Jesus answered them, did I myself, and he's talking here to the 12, did I not myself choose you the 12, and yet one of you is a devil? So Jesus knew about Judas when he chose him. So next let's deal with 2 factors in the betrayal statement that we've just read. One is the money. Matthew 26:15 says, and Judas said, what are you willing to give me to deliver him up to you? Remember, Judas was a thief, to put it bluntly. And they, that's the you above, is the they now, both are of the chief priest, weighed out to him 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver is a term that shows up in Scripture more than once. And Matthew wrote then in chapter 27, verse 9, then that which was spoken through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled, saying, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one whose price had been set by the sons of Israel. And that is referred to, I believe, in Zechariah 11, verse 12. And Zechariah writes this, and I, Yahweh, said to them, but if it is good, and this version of Yahweh is Jesus, I believe, pre-incarnate, and I, Yahweh, said to them, if it is good in your sight, give me my wages, but if not, never mind. This is where Zechariah was comparing a good shepherd and a bad shepherd. So as they weighed out my 30 shekels of silver, they So they weighed out 30 shekels of silver as my wages. They said, this is what you're worth, your work is worth. Luke adds a little bit more to that. Luke 22, verses 3 and 4. And Satan entered into Judas. This was, we'll see next time in the next session at the upper room meal, the Seder, if you please, who was called Iscariot. So let me read that from the beginning again. And Satan entered into Judas, who was called Iscariot, man from Cariot, belonging to the number of the 12, which Judas was. And he went away and discussed with the chief priests and officers how he might betray him, Jesus, to them. So Judas is saying, or Luke is saying, that the 30 pieces of silver were the same as were being given to the shepherd who was rejected by Israel, and that was Jesus. That this is what the 30 pieces of silver were about. Officers, by the way, of the Sanhedrin were temple guard. They were the security force for the temple. We know how Judas later dealt with that silver. Zacharias gives a clue a bit too. Zechariah 11:13. Then the Lord said to me, then Yahweh said to me, throw it to the potter, that magnificent price at which I was valued by them. Remember, the chief priests, valued Judas' betrayal as being worth 30 pieces of silver, a magnificent price. So I took the 30 shekels of silver and threw them to the potter, and Judas, it turns out, we'll see later, threw those 30 pieces back into the temple in the house of the Lord. Matthew 27 adds a touch at verse 6. And the chief priest took the pieces of silver and said, it's not lawful for us to throw them into the temple treasury. Judas just threw them in and scattered on the floor. They said, well, we can't pick it up and put it in the treasure since it is the price of blood, which Judas' betrayal led to the crucifixion of Jesus. And then 4 verses later, in verse 10, Matthew says, and they give them for the potter's field as Yahweh directed me. So Judas's money was given to buy a potter's field. Do you remember what it said in Isaiah about where the Messiah, after his death, was to be buried? It was with the poor. That would have been in the potter's field. We know, though, that the rest of Isaiah says, but he's not going to be buried there. He's going to be buried with the rich, which was Joseph of Arimathea's unused tomb. Look at Exodus 21:32. That tells you something about how 30 pieces of silver were valued. It says, if the ox gores a male or female slave, the owner of the ox shall give his or her master, the slave's master, 30 shekels of silver. So 30 shekels of silver was the price to purchase a slave normally. And that verse ends by saying, and afterwards the ox shall be stoned. So the opportune time spoken of in Judas' betrayal, said Judas was looking for an opportune time. Luke 26, verse 6. And he consented and began, that's Judas, consented to the chief priests, and he began seeking a good opportunity to betray him to them apart from the multitude. Judas knew he had to get Jesus separated from the crowd of pilgrims at this event. And the opportune moment would be a time when the Passover crowds, the Passover pilgrims, would not be present. So Luke said that's what Judas was looking for, a time where he could get Jesus delivered over with no crowd around, no crowd of Passover pilgrims, at least, around. So the Passover crowds were to be absent at this time. But first, something else was in the offing. Go back to Mark 14:12. And on the first day of unleavened bread, that would be Nisan 15, or at least after 6 o'clock on the 14th, when the Passover lamb was being sacrificed, his disciples said to him, so Jesus' disciples said to him, where do you want us to go and prepare for you to eat the Passover, meaning the Seder? A bit of information about the start of Passover again. According to Exodus, the Passover lamb was to be selected on Nisan 10. I spoke of that last time. Was to be killed on Nisan 13 and eaten in the Seder Passover meal between 6 p.m. and midnight, which is right after Nisan 14, the Passover day had begun. Any part of the lamb that was not to be eaten was to be burned. So we're just repeating something we had said the other day. And Jesus responded in verses 13 and 15. He sent two of his disciples and said to them, go into the city. We assume this means Jerusalem and not Bethany. And a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. There wouldn't be too many men carrying pitchers of water. That was a woman's task normally, but there would be a man so described. And Jesus said, follow him. Wherever he enters, say to the owner of that house, the teacher says, where is my guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he himself, he's talking about the man who is the owner of the house, will show you a large upper room, which was where the Seder was held, furnished and ready, and prepare for us there. So he says, when the guy shows you, prepare the Seder at that time. Well, it's fairly straightforward and complete, provided the one player carrying the pitcher of water came in as described. The nature of Jesus' response has caused some to assume that Jesus had set this whole room thing up in advance, and that's entirely possible that he knew who was coming in, when, and where it would be, and that. So, and he expected the owner of the house to say yeah, so not surprising that people would believe it was set up in advance by Jesus, but evidently separate from the knowledge of the 12. But what happened if we didn't know? As if we didn't know. Mark 14:16, the disciples went out and came to the city, found it just as he, Jesus, had told them, and they prepared the Passover. A bit later, Mark 14:17, when it was evening, he, Jesus, came with the 12. I assume that whoever prepared the Passover meal and set it up had to go back and tell the others where they were. Not that Jesus wouldn't have known, but he would not have used that knowledge probably. I don't know. And as the meal was to begin, Jesus gave a bombshell. As they were reclining at the table and eating, Jesus said, "Truly I say to you that one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." That's about all Mark said, except for the response of the 12 in verse 19. They, the 12, began to be grieved and to say to him one by one, "Surely not I?" Luke gives us a bit more in Luke 22:21. But behold, the hand, this is Jesus talking, behold, the hand of the one betraying me is with me on the table. For indeed the Son of Man is going as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed. And 23, and they began to discuss among themselves which one of them it might be, who was going to do this thing. And there arose also a dispute among them, and this is really slick. There arose a dispute among them as to which of them was regarded to be the greatest. They haven't given up that argument yet, wanting to be numero uno. They couldn't understand whom would be the betrayer, except Judas, of course, knew. But they still had a desire to be numero uno themselves. Never mind what day this was, Passover now, when they got there, and what was about to happen. So they didn't even consider that. They just wanted to keep arguing about who was going to be first. Jesus kept them on track. Luke discusses the greatest problem and Jesus related teaching to it. But what did Mark say? Well, in verse 20, and he, Jesus, said to them, "It is one of the 12, one who dips with me in the bowl." So he makes it very specific. It's one of you guys. Get it? And the wind-up to this part of the event included a stern warning to Jesus, one that we just read from Luke a minute ago. For the Son of Man is to go just as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man, Jesus, is betrayed. How bad will be? It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. Well, next time we're going to go into the event of the Seder a bit farther. We'll look at that when we get there. Hopefully you will be